Welcome to Rich Your Soul, Graham Lutz. It's great to have you join us today.
Yeah, so glad to be here, Rocky. Really pumped to chat again.
I am excited to continue our conversation. We always like to begin at the beginning, though. What was it like when you were growing up, and how much did your family and school teach you about money?
Good question. So let's see. Not a lot specifically, right? So I don't ever remember having any specific financial education. I didn't have a class in school. I went to private schools. I was homeschooled for a little while. I went to some public schools, and none of those places had any financial education at all. I was pretty lucky to grow up in a household with a dad who did pretty well, both as an employee and as an entrepreneur, and got to be surrounded by a bunch of people who did pretty well with money, right? So the money discussions that I was part of put me in a pretty good spot compared to most people, I think.
Were those discussions after he became an entrepreneur?
Um, uh, I don't remember one way or the other. I've kind of always thought of him pretty much as an entrepreneur. Even when he was an employee, he was kind of part of the leadership team of this company. Felt very much like, uh, felt very entrepreneurial. Yeah,
And that would make sense.
yeah.
So it sounds like the conversations weren't intentional. It was more just you being around the conversations around money.
Being around the conversations and the ways that people would interact with money, the ways my dad interacted with money. He bought, 2-year-old Toyota cars, 3-year-old Toyota cars, right? And all of his buddies did the same thing and lived in, nice houses, but nothing that was outlandish. It was very much the millionaire next door, right? A bunch of people who were good with money. And so growing up for me, there was never a question of whether or not I was going to do well financially, right? Like I just always knew that I was going to do well for myself. I didn't necessarily know how, and I've had some ups and downs. Some things worked better than others, right? But it's been interesting as an adult having these kind of conversations with friends and realizing that for many of them, the conversations around money when they were kids have them in a spot, and we'll get into limiting beliefs a little bit later, have them in a spot where it is way harder to make good financial decisions, way harder to take the kind of appropriate career risks that one needs to take to do well financially, and those kinds of things. I didn't realize it at the time, but I'm very fortunate that I grew up with the examples that I had of money, and happy to be where I'm at now because of that in a lot of ways.
Can you give me an example of a career risk?
Yeah, well, so maybe career risk isn't the right word. Um, I think it's more about people don't go after certain careers because they don't believe that it's available to them. They don't believe they are one of the people who can make a couple $100,000 in tech, right? I have this conversation a lot. So I was in software for a decade, leadership for most of that. But I got there because a business failed and I had kids who needed to eat. And so I just went and learned how to write JavaScript and got a job as a software engineer. And I love helping other people get into tech in that way. But there are so many people who simply don't have the belief strong enough that they can be one of those people who can make the good money. That they just don't make the effort, and I guess so in that case, don't take the risk, right, of putting in the effort if it might not pan out.
So we call them money scripts,
Yeah,
and they've got scripts that say I can't,
yeah.
and those limiting beliefs will definitely hold you back. throughout life. Whereas if you believe you can, then things all come together. And we're going to talk about that today
Yeah.
and how to change those.
Yeah.
You made a comment to me before we hit record, though. You also grew up in a very religious background.
Yeah. So, think of suburban, southern United States, very conservative Christian area. Everybody looked like me. Everybody thought like me. We all went to the same church. And that was the bubble that I was in until my early 20s, when I went back to school to Georgia State to get a neuroscience degree. And it was very quick that I was sitting in some of these classes having to ask myself, like, am I willing to engage honestly with this material? Right? I had to ask, am I willing to be wrong about these beliefs that I've kind of based my whole life on up until this point? Glad to say that I was. I have since spent most of my life focused in one form or another on neuroscience and psychology. And that's ultimately become this idea of being the willingness to be wrong has become the basis of a lot of what I do now, speaking, coaching, my book, etc.
How did neuroscience, I don't know what's the right word, how was there this issue with neuroscience and religious beliefs?
Sure. So maybe it wasn't the neuroscience specifically, but in order to get to the neuroscience classes, you have to take biology and you have to take chemistry and you have to take all of these other science classes that, pretty reliably show that the world is not 6,000 years old. And that the genetic evidence doesn't support this idea that there were two humans 6,000 years ago and that we're all descended from them, and those kinds of things, right? So that's more. It was more of those foundational classes that opened up that kind of opportunity to question, I think, more than anything.
I chalk that up to interpretation of the Bible.
Absolutely. And I feel like we could obviously go on and on and on and on.
We don't need to.
For where I was as a young man, I had my kind of set of beliefs that. Excuse me. I've got a dog wandering around here. Hey, get out of here, bud.
I thought that was God telling you something.
Yeah, right. It might have been. Let's see. What were we talking about? Yeah, so the set of beliefs that I had, right? Young Earth creationism, etc. There are plenty of other interpretations of the Bible that are much more generous, right? And that fit a little better with what we know about the natural world.
And I don't know, have you done any studies of when religion and science kind of parted ways? And how that came to be, or not so much in your purview?
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely would not call myself an expert there. But there is a pretty solid track record of religion being antagonistic towards the kind of hunt for truth about the natural world. Actually, interesting story. So the most published book on Gutenberg's printing press, the Bible.
The Bible.
The second most published thing on the printing press was fake news, right? So at the time, before the printing press, it was, to create a book, to buy a book, cost the average person 4 to 10 times the average annual income. So books just simply weren't available to people, right? Once the printing press showed up, all of a sudden we have the Bible out there such that people are able to read it and interpret it for themselves and then question, hey, this thing that you told us for all these years, I don't see it in here, right? And it was not long after that King Francis I made it illegal to own or use a printing press, and the penalty was the death penalty. And that came just from pressure from the church. I think there's a long history of antagonism between religion generally and science generally. And now I think there's plenty of people today who can very comfortably hold both of those positions, right? And I will not pretend that I know enough to know that any specific thing is wrong or right. And I very much appreciate that people can have their beliefs and I can have mine, and that doesn't bother me one bit.
It's funny because quantum physics is coming back to, oh, wait a minute, there is this possible God particle and
Sure, yeah.
all of this. So it's circling around. I don't think that it's this or that. I think lots of unanswered questions.
There's lots of unanswered questions. And ultimately, that's what I like so much about science, is the hunt for answers to all the unanswered things. So I'm really loving all the quantum physics, and the frontiers that we have today are awesome.
And it's funny, even within science will fight against itself.
Totally.
On what is and what is not acceptable. Yeah. So you did your neuroscience. Now you're back at Harvard, right? You're studying psychology?
Correct. I'm doing a master's in psychology at Harvard right now. I'd like to get a PhD. I've always said if I win the lottery, I'm going to just go back to school and get PhDs and then die as Dr. Lutz. That would be my ultimate goal.
I didn't know you get. We might just put an S, Doctor.
I think Lutz. So. Yeah. Probably.
So you're about to release a book later this year, and it is called. I have it here, and it disappeared. We went through all of this, and
That's
then
right. I can tell you, the book is called "I Could Be Wrong: The Life-Changing Science of Being Wrong Well." So it showed up. The general idea showed up when I was at Georgia State and was wrestling with this question of, can I be wrong? And am I willing to be wrong about these things that were these really deeply held beliefs for me? And that has continued to show up in my own life in a lot of ways. Little ways, such that I've always been a dude who my haircuts had to be zero effort. Right? If I went to get a haircut, I had to be able to get out of the shower, get out of bed, and do nothing to it, and it looked fine. Recently, I got a haircut that was a little bit longer, and in order for it to look good, I had to put a little stuff in it and spend a bit of time. And initially, that was like this struggle for me, and I was thinking, oh, I got to go back and get my haircut again. But then I thought, hold on, am I willing to be wrong about this? Am I willing to change the way that I've done this for 39 years of my life? And I decided yes. So now it takes me, a minute and a half to do my hair, and I feel really good about it. So that's a very small example of this idea of like the willingness to be wrong. But it shows up in much bigger things all the time. I mean, it shows up in reactions that I have when my kids are being especially rough, right? And it shows up in, the way that I talk to myself in my head when I'm struggling with something, right? And so this willingness to be wrong is really focused on understanding how our brains work, and that our brains just are wrong about things often. I mean, we have all of these neurological mechanisms that evolved 1 million years ago that were incredibly valuable at the time, but are downright maladaptive today, right? The neural mechanisms that kept us from getting eaten by a lion are the same mechanisms that we're using to interact with that ambiguous email from your boss's boss, right? Like, you're not going to die, but your body doesn't understand that this is different.
I was going to say, what are some of these other things that we're wrong about
Hmm.
because of our historicals?
Yeah. Do you remember a few years ago the red and gold, black and blue dress?
I remember something about it, but I
Okay.
don't remember it.
Sure. There was a image of a dress that kind of took the internet by storm. I feel like it was maybe 2015 or 2017. I don't remember. But anyway, half the population saw the same image. Half of people saw it as yellow and gold. Sorry, white and gold. And the other half of people looked at it, same image, and saw it as blue and black. And the people who saw it one way were flabbergasted that there were people who literally were seeing something different. And it wasn't just that there was miscommunication. It wasn't a misinterpretation. It's like these people literally saw two different things. There has since been a bunch of research done based on the questions that came out of it. How could this be happening? Right? That we have this thing that people just see so differently. There's a researcher, Pascal Wallish, I think he was at NYU at the time. Is a vision researcher. And basically what he came to after doing setting up a bunch of studies to answer some questions around these things is that our brains simply put filters on things based on our previous experiences. So the best way he was able to predict if someone was going to see this thing as white and gold or black and blue was their chronotype. So people who were more likely to get up early saw it as black and blue. People who were more likely to be night owls saw it as white and gold. And it was because of a difference in the amount of natural light that they experience generally in their lives. Right? So the people getting up early are just more likely to experience more natural light, and therefore their brain put the natural light filter, an expectation that this image is in natural light and therefore it looked this way. Right? Whereas the night owls are more likely to experience light like these fluorescent lights that we all have, and therefore their brains put a different filter on the image. So all of that to answer your question of what are these things that we're wrong about, there's tons of things like that where the brain just makes the decision for you. It's based on previous experiences, upbringing, beliefs, etc., and it happens below the level of conscious awareness, right? And so but it feels so real, right? And we've got just a laundry list of these kinds of things.
I've always wondered if the green you see is the green I see, because my green might be your purple.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. There is nothing objective about perception at all. Like the green you see and the green I see, the only thing that we know is the same is their wavelength. Right? This is an objective piece of reality that we can measure this wavelength of light. We then both call it green, right? But who knows if my perception and your perception are what it's like to have my perception and what it's like to have your perception. If those are the same, I don't know that that's an answerable question, honestly.
There's no real way to figure it out either.
Yeah.
So what prompted you to write the book?
That's a good question. So something I've always wanted to do is teach and coach and speak. And I remember years ago at a kind of pivotal career moment, sitting down and doing one of these exercises of just kind of figuring out what it is I really want out of life. And one of those things that I came to was this idea of the application of newly acquired knowledge. I love learning and then putting this new thing that I've learned into practice, right? So, writing a book obviously is just part of building a career as a thought leader, as a coach, as a speaker. So that's basically it. Is that it? It's a way to get the thoughts out there, but ultimately it's because I am just wildly fascinated with the brain, neuroscience, psychology, how all this stuff works, how the interplay of that with kind of personal relationships with others, with yourself, with leadership, with teams, etc. So yeah, that's kind of how I got to that.
And I think in the book, we alluded to this earlier when we were talking about limiting beliefs.
Hmm.
You have some things in there. So let's go back to that whole limiting belief and the pay and maybe expand upon that.
Sure. Yeah. So the limiting beliefs thing is interesting. If you Google limiting beliefs, there's 37 million results, right? They all say the same thing, which is basically limiting beliefs are bad. You should stop. You should not have limiting beliefs, right? It doesn't go a lot deeper than that. But the fact of the matter, there is a lot more than that to limiting beliefs. And at a high level, beliefs play into this calculation that happens in your brain below the level of conscious awareness that determines huge amounts of your life, right? So let's see. Let's talk about genetically modified rats for a minute. This is a bit of a sidebar, but it plays into the limiting beliefs. I promise I'll get us back there. There's a study done on rats where they genetically modified these rats such that they could not create their own dopamine. Right? Most people know of dopamine as the reward chemical, right? These rats would not, without the dopamine, they would not look for water, food. They made no attempt to have sex. They would not remove themselves from noxious stimuli. Like you could shock these rats and they wouldn't try to avoid it. They simply did not have the neurochemistry necessary to be motivated to take action. Now,
neither do most humans, but that's another story.
Yeah, absolutely. And so that's actually that's how this is related. When they then supplemented these rats with something called levodopa, which is Parkinson's disease medicine today, it's a precursor to the metabolic creation of dopamine. When they supplemented these rats, now they did look for food and try to get water and attempt to mate and all the normal things that rats do, right? The point being that everything that you do, every action you take, everything you feel, think, say, like that is neurochemistry being experienced by us in real time, right? And so when you are sitting here thinking, hey, I can either send this email, make the phone call that it feels a little scary, or I can go eat some cookies and watch Netflix. For some people, that decision is pretty easy, right? For some people, it's relatively easy to just make the good business decision, to make the good financial decision, to make the good food decision. And for other people, it's way harder. And a lot of that comes down to these subconscious calculations that happen below the level of conscious awareness. So there's this little portion of our brain called the habenula. And this thing is responsible for deciding where and how much dopamine gets sent into different areas of the brain, right? And it does that in large part based on beliefs about various pros and cons of different actions, right? So again, back, you're sitting here thinking, okay, do I do this kind of scary, hard thing that's the right thing to do, that's going to reliably make my life better? Or do I eat cookies and watch Netflix? Cookies and Netflix, we know, is going to work. There's no question of whether or not I'm going to enjoy myself with a handful of Oreos watching, true crime with my wife. Like, definitely that's going to be a pleasurable experience, right? The question then becomes, is it worth it to skip that and instead do this thing that that might get me closer to what I want out of my life? So the way that the dopamine plays into this is that dopamine is actually the anticipation of reward chemical. So our brains do these calculations deciding where to send dopamine if I believe really strongly that I have the ability to succeed, that if I take these actions, it will result in what I want, and that my life will be reliably different or better by doing this hard thing, then that plays into these subconscious calculations. And then I get all of this beneficial neurochemistry that makes it easier to take the actions that lead to benefits long term, right? Meanwhile, limiting beliefs literally do the exact opposite, right? Limiting beliefs, say a belief that, oh, there's no sense in applying to this job, right? Like, there's no sense in going out and taking this risk. I'm going to give up anyway, or I'm going to fail, or whatever. Those kinds of things have a very significant, measurable effect on neurochemistry, and therefore make the right decisions way harder. And so I think of limiting beliefs as kind of this idea, this like the first domino, right? If you can deal with the limiting beliefs about money, for instance, then the decisions that you have to make about money in order to end up in a good place 10, 15, 20, 30 years from now, those decisions are easier in the moment.
And that makes a lot of sense. So I guess what you're saying is our decisions have a lot more to do with chemistry, maybe per se, than they do with what we think or believe or programming.
Well,
or maybe they're somehow connected.
Yeah, they're definitely connected. I think a lot of the point that I like to make with this is that I think the discussion around willpower is kind of the wrong discussion to have, right? So for me, as I mentioned earlier, I grew up with this set of beliefs about money, that I'm capable, that I expect to do well financially. All the men in my life as I was growing up all did well financially. That's just what was modeled for me. So my set of beliefs around money made it very easy for me to take the right actions. Meanwhile, there's lots of people I know who grew up in very different circumstances where, money was talked about as if it was evil, right? Or money was talked about as if, like, it's a constant struggle and you'll never have enough, and this lack mindset all the time, right? So having those things means that it becomes significantly harder for them to make good financial decisions, because the subconscious calculations that are happening include these sets of beliefs, right? And so that the even if you tell that, even if you give them, here, do this, do this, do this, do this, you can hand somebody a plan. But if they have this set of limiting beliefs, It will still be way harder for them to implement the plan through no fault of their own in many cases, right? But they will have the neurochemical state that makes it way harder for them than for you and I. And so what I hope to help people with is all of these kind of this pre-work, right? These first dominoes, dealing with the beliefs and that kind of stuff, so that when they're in the moment of having to make the hard decision, their neurochemical state supports what it is they really want in their life.
And I also want to just say this. There are people who grow up with money who feel guilty about it and don't feel worthwhile, that
Sure.
like they didn't deserve it. And so there's a whole different spectrum.
Right.
It's all over the place.
Right. Yeah.
And two kids can grow up in the same household and have opposite views.
Right.
Because they each have their own neurochemistry.
Yeah.
So let's kind of shift gears here, because when it comes to neurochemistry, science is coming back around to looking at psychedelics and neurochemistry as a way to change neuroplasticity and as a way to help people change their behaviors and also to let go. I think that the area where it's gaining the most traction is PTSD.
Yep. Yeah. So I'm on the board of the Southeast Coalition of Psychedelic Practitioners. The goal here is, access to therapies, training for therapists, and then there's a big political piece, right? I mean, there's laws on the books in different parts of the country that make it really hard for the people who could benefit from psychedelic assisted therapy to access that therapy. And to your point about how it's related, it's all about neuroplasticity, right? Neuroplasticity is simply the fact that our brains can change in response to inputs, right? Our brain changes in response to inputs that we're not in control of, but it also changes in response to things we do control, right? So cognitive behavioral therapy is one of these ways of actively changing your brain, right? And a lot of the stuff that I talk about, a lot of the kind of step-by-step practices that I give people to deal with limiting beliefs hinges on this idea that we can change the patterns in our brain, right? And the way that psychedelics help there is that so there's a very cool study that came out recently that looked to elucidate the mechanisms of action of psychedelics. And they were able to separate the neuroplasticity mechanism from the hallucinogenic mechanism. And there's something called brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is basically the thing that mediates how your brain changes. And psychedelics increase this really significantly, such that while you are taking these and for a good period afterwards, in some cases months, this factor in the brain is upregulated, which gives you an opportunity to have kind of accelerated change in your brain. And this is a lot of the reason it's so valuable for people with PTSD. A lot of the focus is veterans specifically with PTSD right now. And in many cases, PTSD is simply a set of neurochemical states along with neural patterns. So a very specific set of connections of neurons that, you activate the first one and the whole pattern runs without any additional effort, right? So we need to change that in order to fix the PTSD. In order to change that, we need to harness neuroplasticity. In order to do that, psychedelics upregulate all the things we need to allow for that change to happen.
And I know we've been saying chemical, But in reality, these are all electrical signals.
Well, so
Many
there's
of them?
both. So there's
Okay.
definitely both. So connections between neurons are electrical, right? So this neuron will fire, it sends this electrical signal that disseminates throughout the brain. Things like dopamine, serotonin, oxytocin, all of these other neurochemicals, those act slightly differently, right? You have, two neurons next to each other like this. You have this area right here in between the two neurons that's called the synaptic cleft. And one neuron will release the neurochemical in there, right? So ultimately down the line, that turns into another electrical signal, right? But so we have both electrical signals and chemical signals, and yeah, the interplay of those is everything we experience.
I bring that up because the last time we had a conversation, we were talking about mushrooms. Mushrooms kind of being psilocybin and other types of psychedelics.
Mm-hmm.
You made a comment that mushrooms have a communication network that's
Mm.
electrical. I'd
Yeah,
love for you to touch base on that.
yeah. Man, mushrooms are so cool, psychedelic and otherwise. Um, so the first few inches of the earth is completely filled with mycelium networks. These are the underground connections of mushrooms that just literally cover the entire planet in a big network. What we see of mushrooms is what's called their fruiting bodies, right? If you think of a mushroom that you can hold in your hand, that's more or less the sexual organ of of uh, of fungus, but the majority of it exists in these connections and networks underneath the ground, and they also communicate via electrical and chemical signals. The mapping of these networks looks very much like the mapping of neural connections in a lot of ways. And in addition to this, the mushrooms will interact with trees and other organisms in the environment to communicate and to move to move food and fuel around. So like a mother tree will literally send information and nutrients through this mycorrhizal network to that tree's offspring elsewhere in the forest. It is really wild, the similarities between the mushroom networks and neurological networks.
Most people aren't aware of this, are they?
I don't think so. No, I don't think so.
Which
This goes back to something you mentioned earlier when we were talking about religion and about how many things we don't know. And I think one of those things is this idea of consciousness. I'm not convinced that there isn't consciousness in trees and mushrooms and the planet. Like, I would not be surprised if sometime in my lifetime we had a very different relationship with plants because we were able to elucidate some more understanding of what it's like to be a tree or something like that.
is that referring to the 0 point field or is that something different?
Um, I I don't know what's the 0 point field.
It's almost like a universe's communication network.
Okay, yes, I think this is the idea that rather than material being the kind of the basis of reality, that consciousness is actually the basis of reality. Um, so yeah, I think there's something to be said for that theory. There's not currently enough evidence to say anything very conclusively, but there's very interesting questions being posed in that area for sure.
So it's funny because we've been talking religion, we'll go back to the Bible. And there's a part in the Bible, well, there's a couple parts in the Bible. The one part up front is Jesus tells the disciples basically, hey, I talk in stories so that these people can all hear, but they do not know. Right? Whereas I'll tell you small people, the truth, which is kind of where they have the power to do things that no one else can do in a sense. And then there's a further story where he's walking along and this woman comes up to him who's been bleeding forever and touches his cloak, and he stops because he doesn't know it. He's like, who touched me? And everyone's like, you're in a crowd. Everybody's touching you. What are you talking about? And he says, I felt the power go out of me, which comes back to an electrical impulse.
Yep.
And until you can start to really discern and understand that maybe there's other meanings throughout all of this, that we just, it comes back to money mindset, right? If we have a certain belief pattern, we can't see all these other connections and things and possibilities that are out there that we may not even understand.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, you definitely get yourself in a tunnel vision, and so then you only end up seeing what your previous experience and beliefs allows you to see, like that dress, right? They're different people seeing this thing differently, looking at the exact same thing, having a very different experience of reality. Yeah, so there's lots of questions out there, and I love talking about them.
And it's okay to be wrong.
Exactly right. Exactly right. And that's a big thing. So when I initially kind of got my neuroscience degree, I did a bit of a pendulum swing away from religion, and did the angry atheist thing for a little while. And that has mellowed, I think, a little bit as more of these kinds of questions show up with consciousness and that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think approaching all of this with the understanding that we can't possibly know everything, and the chances are we are wrong about a sizable chunk of the things that we believe to be true about the world.
I think that's going to cause a lot of people to have head explosions.
Totally. And so one of the things that I do in my keynote speeches and workshops is kind of work through a set of images and illusions and exercises that kind of that show all these different ways in which we are wrong, right? With the goal of getting people to simply accept that, okay, yeah, I am wrong about stuff, right?
So my next guest is actually I think he's an expert in psychedelics. As I was reading his book, a line popped out at me. And in that book, he said it was a study. It had nothing to do with religion. But what they found is that 2/3 of self-proclaimed atheists in the study going with psychedelics started to question whether or not they were atheists anymore.
Interesting. Yeah.
Because they had, and this is coming up more and more, they had almost the veil taken off that you can start to see the universe, for lack of a better word, like the connections there.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that goes back to perspective, right? We have this very limited perspective of the world. There's a scientist named Donald Hoffman who has written a book called The Case Against Reality. And in it, he talks about one of his theories, a theory of consciousness called the interface theory of perception. Are you familiar with the interface theory of perception? So he talks about it such that we all evolved a certain way of interacting with the data that makes up the universe, right? So, what I see as my knockoff Stanley can also be seen in another way as just a bunch of information organized in a certain way, right? And that each of us, each species, has an interface with which they interact with the data, right? So, for instance, there are electrical signals, there's electricity all over the place, but I cannot interact with it, right? That's not part of my interface with the world. I don't have the electricity icon, right, that I can click on and interact with. Sharks, on the other hand, do. They have electroreception. They have all of these little receptors so that they can at the last few feet before they attack, they can close their eyes to avoid damage to their eyes, yet still be able to know the movements of their prey with really significant accuracy because of these electrical signals they're able to pick up with these receptors around their mouth. Right, and so this is just one example of an extremely different experience of the world, right? And so when you take psychedelics, and not the micro doses, but the heroic doses that begin to melt that interface that you have, all of a sudden you're experiencing this thing outside of the box we've all always only lived in, right? It's the only experience we've ever been able to have. And psychedelics are just a way to have an experience of the world that is different than your interface.
I doubt you're going to be able to answer this question.
Okay.
But I'm going to ask it to throw it out there.
Yeah.
Maybe you'll go study it. Who knows? When babies are born, can they actually experience so much more? But then through that human conditioning of the first couple of years, before we even learn to speak, let's face it.
Yeah.
In any given second, there's a million things going on around me. In the room that I'm in, I ignore 99.9% of it.
Yep.
I'm wondering if we're born with the ability to see it all.
It is certainly possible. And so there's an interesting concept in evolutionary psychology, the idea of innateness. Something can be innate, even if it's not present at birth, right? Pubic hair, for instance, is innate in humans, but not present for the first 12 to 15 years, right? And then there's language, innate in humans, not present for a while, right? So we have the mechanisms to do all of the things, right? We have all of the mechanisms we need to have this pretty reliable interface, right? But it is very possible that we are born with the tools needed to get there, but that it requires experience of the world and, positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, punishments, etc., in order to kind of collapse the available options into this interface that we have now. So yeah, I think that is a really interesting question. Uh-oh, my dog's back here doing it, chasing his tail.
He's telling you yes.
Yes,
heard.
He is. I'd be very interested to see what his experience of the universe is. Luckily, it includes treats and the like.
Dogs are very interested by trees.
Yeah, sure.
Just out of curiosity, what % of our brain do we use?
Yes, that's a good question. It's hard to make an answer. I mean, my perspective there is that we use all of it. this idea that we use 10% of it, or some small percentage of it, um, uh, I think fits in some cases. I like the idea of it that, hey, we're able to do more than we think, or there's more to the world than we think. I think the better question is what is it that our brain could do that it isn't doing?
We
Right?
didn't limit it.
Not correct. Right? And so psychedelics start to answer some of that question is, oh, look, here, the brain can also do this. The brain can also experience the world this way. Right? So I think sitting here like this, yeah, we use our full brain. There's not any portion of it in there that's just sitting here silently, right? But it is so complex that we utilize a very small percentage of the available connections, right?
And there's actually a lot of power within our brain. And I mean power in the sense of actually electrical power
Mm-hmm.
and energy. It uses up a ton of our calories every day, which
Yep.
I don't know people realize. What is it, 20 or 25%?
It's like, yeah, about that. Yeah.
Is used up by your brain every day, and it doesn't even move. Um, it's literally a storage and computer chip in there, in a sense, doing it. And I've heard if they could figure out a way to harness it, like our brains could power our houses, type
Yeah.
of thing.
I honestly wouldn't be surprised.
There's that much kind of electrical power in there. But again, I don't know how it all works, and that's why I rely on experts like you.
Right. Yeah.
Based on our conversation, is there anything else that we should kind of touch on to wrap this all together?
No, I really have liked where this all has gone. These are exactly the kind of conversations I like to have. I think that if there's one point that I want to make, I think, is that this idea of being willing to be wrong is supported by the available neuroscience and psychology evidence. And it is a practice that is incredibly valuable, right? Practicing the willingness to be wrong. It has shown up in my life in a bunch of ways, and I want to encourage everybody to practice being willing to be wrong in the ways you interact with the world, the things you believe about yourself, the things you believe about money.
I agree with that.
Good.
Well, so that comes back, and we haven't talked about this, but that literally comes back to fixed mindset versus growth mindset.
Yeah.
If you're not willing to be wrong, you're stuck in a fixed mindset, and you're not even willing to realize how wrong you are.
Yeah.
In that type of belief, you're stuck in doctrine and programming that you can't even see the rest of the world is laughing at you.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yeah. And the growth mindset, it's like Carol Dweck who made that famous, is very much about this acceptance that, hey, if I do a thing, the world is different, right? That my actions can affect outcomes, right? And so outwardly, yeah, that is incredibly valuable. I want people to take that same idea and apply it to their brains and their neurological processes, right? And by understanding that with effort, you can change the patterns that play up here. And by doing so, you change the inputs into your brain's subconscious calculations, which changes the outputs, neurochemicals, etc., and that significantly changes your experience of the world.
And so we'll close out with a simple example. If you decided you wanted to buy a new BMW, all of a sudden, I assure you, you will see BMWs everywhere. right? You
Yep.
change the programming, look for
Correct.
BMWs, and
Yep.
boom, it shows up.
Yep.
And so I think everyone can relate to that. And then ask yourself, what else is possible?
Yeah. Yep.
What's your secret to living an abundant life?
Good question. Uh, I think it is the willingness to be wrong. Yeah, I mean, I think approaching the world with fewer expectations and fewer constraints on uh, on the types of experiences I'm going to count as valuable or beneficial or positive, right? And being willing to be wrong, which means, I'm going to keep changing. I'm almost 40, hopefully another 40 plus years, and who knows what that's going to bring to me.
What did you learn later in life that you wish you would have learned sooner?
That I have ADHD.
Is that real?
Yeah, very much so. Yeah, it's very much real. I was diagnosed officially September of 22. And yeah, ADHD very much is real. It is the mechanism of action is dopamine reuptake. So I mentioned earlier about how one neuron will secrete dopamine, and it spends time in this synaptic cleft between neurons. And then eventually you have this vacuum cleaner that comes around and pulls the dopamine back in so it can be reused. One of the mechanisms of action of ADHD is overactive dopamine reuptake. So in my brain, dopamine gets squirted out and then immediately gets vacuumed back up. And so it's simply not there. And so I was talking about the rats earlier who laid there and died. When I don't take my ADHD medication, there are times when I can't do things. Like I will literally be sitting thinking like, all right, let's get up, and you've got work to do. It's basically unexplainable to somebody who has not experienced it, but anybody who has ADHD knows that it's different from simply like a willpower discussion.
If you were to give an 18-year-old one specific piece of wisdom, what would it be?
Don't talk shit to yourself.
Where can people find you, learn more about your book, and see what you're up to?
Sure. So my website is grahamlutz.com. Got a newsletter there you can sign up to get info on the book. I'm active on LinkedIn, TikTok, Instagram. I am at Graham Lutz on all those places.
And we'll put that in the show notes. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, so glad to be here, Rocky. Thanks a lot.
Thanks for checking out this unedited video of the Richer Soul podcast. You can find the full episode along with all the back episodes at richersoul.com. This podcast is brought to you by Profit Comes First, where we help business owners to have a more profitable and growing business so they can live the life of their dreams. Check that out as well wherever you listen to all this content.